Hi, this is Nicole Dyer, and today I'm talking about burials in the southern U.S. This is an excerpt from the Research Like a Pro office hours, and in this question, we discuss what happened to people who died in the early times in the southern United States, colonial times, and the early U.S., and were not buried in a proper cemetery, but maybe were buried on the plantation where they lived. Maybe they were buried near their farm. Maybe their grave was marked with a wooden marker or something like that. What happened to those graves over time? And can we ever find those? So join us as we review this question from a Research Like a Pro course member. And I hope you enjoy this excerpt. One is about burials in the South. And we've talked about this a little bit before, but thought it'd be fun to revisit this. The question is regarding burials of plantation owners and their families in the South with ancestors who lived in Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, and Arkansas in the early years until after the Civil War. So if you can't find them on Find a Grave, in cemeteries, or other records close to where they lived or died, what can you do? So was the practice that owners and their families were buried on the plantation? Sometimes the slaves were generally buried in their own area of the plantations. So, who do you think you are? And Finding Your Roots have shown guests of both of these programs walking through brush to burial areas of former slaves, but not the burial areas of the former plantation owners. So, where can we find them? Unfortunately, many of my ancestors' lands have been developed or no longer are recognizable as a working farm. If plantation lands were developed, would the bodies be relocated to a cemetery? And I have also looked in newspapers trying to find mention of deaths. Sometimes I have found probate records. So, for burials in the South, yes, it's true that plantation owners were often buried in family lots on the plantations, perhaps in unmarked graves, or the markers wore away over time and were lost. And there could be burials in other places like churches. For example, our ancestor Thomas B. Royston was buried in the church cemetery, the Baptist church. And that's a picture of his memorial there. But that was in the latter half of the 1800s. So usually for the time periods before the railroad, you're not going to see stone headstones. And so I did a little research and I was reading in chapter 38 of North Carolina Research. And in that chapter, Leora McKern talked about cemetery records. And she said, rarely did the family bring its deceased members with it. And she's talking about moving family graveyards when they moved away from the plantation. So rarely did the family members bring its deceased family members with it when they moved, but in some instances, later descendants moved the family graveyard, invariably enclosing it within a 4-foot chain link fence. So the idea here was that originally settlers would start a farm or a plantation along a watercourse. And when they later moved away from the watercourses into towns or other places, the people who were buried on the farm or the plantation were usually left behind. They didn't usually bring their deceased family members by digging them up and bringing them. It did happen sometimes, and we even have seen before in probate records, like in one of Diana's case studies, where a will was directing the heirs to go ahead and move the grave of one person to another place. But that didn't always happen. And so probably most of our ancestors are buried in family land and just never were moved. And the characteristics of these early family graveyards before the time of railroads were that they didn't use stones, they used pine or other kinds of wood to identify the graves. And that's because it was very costly to transport stone, and there wasn't a lot of stone available in North Carolina, at least. And who knows in your area if there was a lot of stone available. So you'll probably find that these older family graveyards used wood. And they would carve or burn the name, age, and death date of the person into the marker. And if you do find a family graveyard, because they do still exist if they haven't been built or developed over in some cases, you can still see some remnants of these wooden markers, but a lot of the times they've been rendered illegible due to time just erasing the inscriptions with wind and water and all that. Sometimes there have been fires that have destroyed the boards, and sometimes they just fall over, get bulldozed over. And so Leora says in her chapter, if the houses have fallen and if the stones in the graveyard have collapsed, how is a bulldozer operator to know not to drive through it? And so I've seen stories of people, going back to the farmland of their ancestors and asking the owner, where's the graveyard? And a lot of the times, the people that live there still do know where these private graveyards are and they can take you to them. But other times, they're just forgotten and they've been bulldozed over and the area has been developed. So, although on the TV shows, they can sometimes find places for us to go walk through and see where our ancestors were buried, most of the time, I don't think that's possible. And so I think it is really lucky if you do get to find an old family graveyard that's a private one like that, because they just don't have the public or private money like that a commercial cemetery would have to keep it up. And so often they've just been really dilapidated. So sadly, we won't be able to find cemeteries and family graveyards and headstones for all of our early Southern ancestors, which is very sad. But
Well,
it would be great if we could.
so that reminds me of when we were in Oklahoma a year ago. I'd wanted to find the headstone of my Royston ancestor. And when did he die? He died 1915. And I had seen pictures of his headstone and I had the name of the cemetery. So I put it in the GPS and we kept driving by this little gully trying to figure out where in the world the cemetery was. And finally, I noticed this little pathway off and there was this tall grass everywhere as we took this gravel road up. And there was the cemetery. And it did have, the marker. This was the name of it, but the grass was 3 feet tall. And there was a lady out weed whacking the grass.
Oh
And
no.
her family has taken care of that cemetery for years. But
Oh.
it is a private cemetery. And if you didn't know exactly where it was, and if she wasn't out there weed whacking, you'd have to just search through that 3 foot tall grass to find your gravestones. So that was a really good lesson for me that yeah, there may be something out there, but again, the earliest ones there, they were all stone and they would have been, post railroad age, nothing super early. So
I highly recommend
interesting.
this chapter. This chapter was so fun to read by Leora McKern. I don't know if that's how you say her name, but she has years of experience going to cemeteries in North Carolina. And it was really fun to read her experiences and to learn from her wisdom.
That's awesome. And
Well,
that's such a great book. I love that.
yes,
Helen
it
Larry's
has
book.
so many chapters about every kind of record type.
Hmm.
And the comment from Robin about unearthing old gravestones that had been years of under years of soil reminded me of a family reunion we had in Colorado one time. And a bunch of the headstones, the grave markers had been flat on the ground. That's how they were originally done. And the grass had just completely grown over them. So all the kids and everyone had fun clearing off the grass and the dirt and re-exposing those grave markers. But yeah, that's a lot of work
That's
to
neat.
keep up all these graves, and often the grave that we're looking for is hiding behind 3 feet of grass and buried under dirt. So we have to
Yeah.
get out there and walk around in the fields.
Hmm. And I read somebody that had written a blog post and they said if you do go cemetery traipsing, make sure you wear boots to protect against snakes and bugs. And so, of course, when we went, I was in flip-flops and shorts, and so I was not very well prepared.
You were not ready for that.
I was not prepared for that, but it's
Well,
always fun.